Thanks for coming in. Maybe let's start, maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Tapestry Opera.
My name is Jaime Martino. I'm the Executive Director of Tapestry Opera based here in Toronto. Tapestry Opera is a 45-year-old company. We are fairly unique in the opera space in that we only make new work. So we work with living composers, librettists to create new works of opera. We're very interested in the kinds of stories that we can tell that aren't traditionally represented on opera stages. We are interested in the sort of breadth and scope of Canadian experience, which really could encompass an infinity of stories. And we are interested in the ways that other genres and other art forms influence the work. And so we are not trying to make new versions of Mozart. We are interested in the ways that Persian classical music and turntablism and Afro-Caribbean mythology and pan-Indigenous storytelling across the entire country and hip-hop, and these are all real works that we've done, how those influences can expand the scope of what we mean when we say opera. And really, our definition of opera is very simple. It is powerful music that tells an emotional story with virtuosic performers. And when you boil it down to that, that could look like anything. And so one of our key mandate is to make new works of opera to tell new stories. But when we operate sort of from those principles, what it means in practice is that we are always looking for what other story is here, what else is there here to talk about, what other influence could we have on this art form and this sector that is hundreds and hundreds of years old.
So where do you draw that inspiration from as a company? Do you have, I'm just curious about the structure of the company. Do you have artists in residence? Do you have composers in residence? Where do you get those influences from? Or are you going out into the broader community and identifying, like you said, we need something, or something's popped up on our radar, the Afro-Caribbean experience in the Canadian context? Where did the inspiration come from?
Sure, a number of places. The most reliable is a program that we have run since 1995. It was the first program of its kind, maybe in the world, certainly in North America, called the Composer Librettist Laboratory, where we bring together composers and playwrights often, who some of them had written libretti before and many had not. And we bring them together in a 10-day intensive where there are 4 composers, 4 librettists, and they each pair with each other once. So in the end, we have 16 short pieces. They have 1 day to write the libretto, 1 day to write the score, and then singers perform it at the end of the 2nd day. And it is just an incredibly rich and vibrant artistic experience. And every idea is a good idea until it's not, and it's just an incredible wealth of creativity and inspiration. And occasionally what will happen is that a piece that is created in that program is developed into a full-length piece. More often what happens is that we find a really charismatic composer-librettist duo. And then either we talk to them about what else they would like to do, as this is what happened with the Afro-Caribbean story, or they come back to us and say, we've been talking and we think this might be cool. And then we go through a 3 to 5 year development process where we have a series of workshops and until it ultimately makes its way onto the main stage.
So I'm curious about, you talk about the program that you've just described, as an innovation to find more work, to build a community that's able to create the work. Where does that spirit of innovation come from? Is it something that you've inculcated inside the organization, or is it just a natural byproduct of being on the avant-garde when it comes to the type of works that you're producing?
I think both. There is certainly an organizational inheritance of boundary pushing and of not taking no for an answer and of doing things that are outside the norm for our sector. We had a long-standing, so we've only had 2 artistic directors, the founding artistic director, Wayne Strongman, who handed over to our current artistic director, Michael Morey, who's my co-executive. And there was a long-standing producer and general manager, Claire Hopkinson, who went on to run the TAC and then the world. And she tells a story about talking to someone in New York from Opera America and saying, "Oh, I'm from Tapestry, we make new work," and that person literally turning his back on her in the elevator. Like there was, for many, many years, there was a real sense that what we were trying to do did not matter. That in fact it was an insult to the heritage of the art form that we were operating within. And so there's sort of an institutional muscle of finding our certainty in ourselves and in the work, and in an understanding that things must change, that they must adapt, that there is no universe in which an organization or an art form can be static and ossified over centuries and have it continue to thrive. And so that is built into the DNA of the company and our core mandates. And Michael Mori and I also just are those people.
So you're not afraid to say no, you're not afraid to think outside the box. How has that attitude influenced the way you fundraise, the way you attract audience, the way you connect with the communities you're delivering this art for?
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways it's good news, bad news. In the bad news way, it's people crave familiarity. And so people tend to know what you mean if you say, buy a ticket to the Nutcracker, buy a ticket to Carmen. There's a cultural baseline of understanding that people know what they're getting. They may not like it, in which case they know that they don't like it, and that's sort of the flip side. But on the other hand, it really does allow us to lead with vision. And it draws to us the kind of people who are there not for familiarity, but for innovation. And so when I first joined the company 9 years ago, we were in sort of a period of tumultuous transition from the founding artistic director to Michael had been there for a couple of years. And we were trying to find our feet. And one of the problems that we kept thinking that we had identified was that every show was different. And so we didn't know how to build a brand identity around our artistic offerings. And of course, the answer that became very obvious to us was that the variety is the offering, that you come to us not when you're looking for something familiar, but when you're looking for something new.
When you're putting on works that nobody's familiar with and nobody's comfortable with, and you have these partnerships with other organizations, are you working in partnership not just on the creation of it, but also audience expansion? Because I imagine it would be difficult to go out into the broader community and try and sell a ticket to something they don't know what they're going to experience.
Yeah, it depends on the partnership, but often we will collaborate on marketing materials. How do we speak to your audiences differently than we speak to our existing audiences? How else can we get in front of people in the geographic area of the theater, for example? Or this piece is in partnership, but it's about this subject matter. So who else is working on this subject matter? And we'll approach them together as partners often. And that we are unusual in that in opera as well, in that we work in partnership a lot, and we work in partnership outside of opera. And so we often consider ourselves, we operate more closely to a theater company than to a big opera company. But I mean, you would be hard pressed to find an arts organization that is not consumed with the hustle of ticket sales. It is a perennial challenge. It is an increasing challenge. It's harder after the pandemic, noticeably harder after the pandemic. Everything is more expensive after the pandemic. Our productions are 30 to 50% more expensive. And that is I would say a consuming factor in the sector at large. If you talk to anybody who runs an arts organization and you catch them off guard, and you ask them, how are things going? Getting audiences in has long been an issue.
So if your costs are up 30 to 50% in terms of putting on a production, what are the solutions in order to keep the mission going? You could raise ticket prices 30 to 50%. That's not going to go over too well. You can expand your audience. And so obviously you've been working at that. Maybe, is there something about what you've been doing to, and I'm going to say two things, expand your audience or inspire your existing audience to stay connected with the theater, especially as you come through something like COVID?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you what we did, which is to build a theater. If I look back on I want to talk about the theater because it's really exciting, but if I look back on our pattern of operations over the 9 years that Michael and I have been running the company together, um, we are always doing something new. There's always something to tell. In fact, our biggest problem is not that we don't have enough interesting things to tell our people about. It's that we don't have the capacity to run all of them down all the time. We're very, very good at doing the cool thing. So in the middle of the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, we asked ourselves, okay, we just canceled our entire season. We were, I think, the first company in the city, or one of the first companies in the city, to just say, we're not doing a live season this year. We were watching people around us have 5, 6, 7 production scenarios where we get to this date before we have to pay this designer, and if we can't do it, then we don't. And we don't have the HR capacity or the financial capacity to go halfway down the road of production. And so we said very early, we're just going to cancel this season. We're going to rework our next few seasons, and we're just going to do that. And then we're going to do the work that we know we're going to be able to do.
Give me an example of what that looked like, and how did that maintain or build connection with your audience?
There was a small scope of work we knew we were going to be able to do, and it was digital, and it was outdoor. And so in March, we didn't do outdoor work, but we did determine that we were going to do a series of made-for-digital music videos that we shot like small short films. I found filmmaking profoundly unsatisfying, and I was very glad to go back to live theater. But what it allowed us to do was continue to pay artists and then tell our supporters that we were continuing to pay artists. So when we went to them for our regular fundraising, we didn't have to say, help us keep our doors open. We could say, help us pay these artists. Your work is supporting artists in this difficult time. And it was true. And then we launched an outdoor traveling stage. We bought a snowmobile trailer and converted it into a traveling stage. And we took that all around the city, starting with care homes and hospitals, because we were thinking about, like, we're having a hard time, but there are people having a much harder time than us. And what can we do to inspire ourselves as much as them? Like, what do we need to feel like we are putting something real and good and joyful into the world? And that became a program that continues to this day. Box Concerts has been running for 5 years now, and we go back to the same care homes year over year. It has evolved at the beginning of the pandemic, you could buy a Box Concert to come to your house, and you could gather your neighbors outside. People stopped needing that, and so now we use it as a community building mechanism where we'll take the concert to your house for free, but you have to gather 25 of your neighbors. And we'll provide you with a flyer to go door to door. And it was about building connection around you where you are. And so through all of that, we in our roles got to talk about and plan for exciting things that we were excited about. And we got to be very genuine and proactive about how we were handling a crisis. And we got to go out to our supporters with vision and with leadership and with a clear artistic perspective and with real offerings that were going to make people's lives better.
But is it maybe an indelicate question, is it a function of your size, your culture, that allows you to say, let's go buy a snowmobile trailer? Because I can see a lot of other organizations who maybe couldn't get even something like that tabled for a board discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a wonderful board who are filled with trust for the way that Michael and I lead the company, and to whom we are very accountable. But they are on the board of Tapestry because they are bought into the vision. But certainly we are at a good size where we are large enough to have staff and structure and expertise and some resources, but we are small enough that we're not carrying, for example, a collective bargaining agreement with an orchestra of 100, which has to be, like, we have some flexibility, we have some agility, and we are very high producers. And so there's a real culture of think of a thing, we'll run it down. Okay, let's go do it. And that is a real luxury of being the size that we are.
Obviously, I'm assuming you want to grow, you want to expose more people to the work that's coming out. Do you have a vision for how do you grow sustainably in alignment with the values that you've imposed on the organization, or not imposed, but that the organization lives and breathes every day, without sacrificing that? Because I imagine you mentioned building a theater. Mm-hmm. That introduces another set of challenges and dynamics, because now you still don't have an orchestra to pay for, but space to pay for.
We have space to pay for.
How do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we talk about this actually a lot. And so when I project, I just did a budgetary exercise where I plotted out sort of the next 5 years of budgets and what do we hope to look like, and where can we grow, and where do we maintain. And I think, are interested in growth only to a point, that there is a sweet spot where we retain the agility, we retain the flexibility and the sort of spirit of being able to take advantage of an opportunity that is presented, which can get trickier as you get bigger. And the theater is such a unique little gem in the city. So for you or your listeners who may not know, Toronto has been experiencing a real crisis in creative and theatrical space. And it's not just performance space, it's rehearsal space. It's very, very hard to find somewhere suitable. And it's very expensive, or they're very unavailable. They're booked till 2027. It's been a problem for a bunch of years as sort of a general Toronto city planning situation, but it was really exacerbated by the pandemic. We lost a bunch of spaces that closed during the pandemic, and Tapestry, we lost our studio space, our rehearsal space in the Distillery District when Artscape went bankrupt. And so when that happened, we asked ourselves, do we want to divest ourselves of a physical space? And we realized that not only would that make our lives much harder and much more beholden to other organizations who have spaces, which is a challenging position to be in, but that our mandate to serve our community would be unfulfilled if we did not have somewhere to offer. And so we have an incredible partnership with an affordable housing corporation, a not-for-profit called St. Clair's, and we sort of kicked up a fuss when we were rent-evicted from the Distillery District, and they saw the press release and reached out to us and said, we've got a couple spaces you should look at. And one of them was in the basement of a 14-story affordable housing high-rise at Yonge and Bloor. And it had been a retirement home that had been converted in 2019. It was purchased by the city for affordable housing in 2019. And since its conversion, the amenities space, these huge amenities spaces in the basement, had gone unused because people weren't confined to the building the way that they were when it was a retirement home. And so the executive director, Andrea Adams, came to us and said, we're really interested in ways that our sectors work together, that our constituents work together. We're interested in ways that we can permeate the boundary between sort of the Rosedale and Yorkville community around us and the affordable housing building here and the tenants who live here, and what we can do to make that a more reciprocal relationship and show that affordable housing is a benefit to a community. And philosophically, I find that very, very compelling. The truth is that the crises that are faced by a rising homeless population are the same. It's all the same affordability crisis. It's all the same crisis of a lack of political vision. We're all sort of contending with the same thing. It's just showing up differently in different sectors. And so because of that, we have a subsidized rate. We raised $4 million to build this theater. So we have a 150-seat black box theater. We have a rehearsal studio. We have a green room and offices. And we are in partnership with Nightwood Theatre. And so it's a three-way partnership. And so even the model that we were able to develop for this theater has us being subsidized by one another and by St. Clair's, and providing a service to the community that is very, very difficult to replicate elsewhere.
I'm really curious though, you talked earlier about kind of partnerships, but partnerships in terms of you're an arts organization partnering with other arts organizations. And now you're talking about an arts organization partnering with an affordable housing organization. Is this just another level of innovation that we're not seeing enough of in, call it the nonprofit or the social sector?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's funny because it feels obvious to us. Like a lot of the time when we're doing these things, it doesn't necessarily feel like innovation. It feels like, well, who's doing this right? Oh, these guys. Well, we'll just go talk to them. And I do think that cross-sectoral partnerships are in maybe an underexplored avenue in most not-for-profit sectors.
So how do you then build the capacity or the ability or the agility for somebody who's in a very narrowly defined nonprofit space to think broadly and say, who else could appreciate the work that we're doing in the spirit of partnership? Because it takes two people to come together, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would take this back to, and so not all of our partnerships pan out. I'm telling you about the ones that were successful. I cannot tell you the number of phone calls and emails and meetings that I have had that went nowhere. And I think that's just kind of par for the course in when you're building anything. You fail more than you succeed, and those failures are what drive you to success. But I think that a key factor is that we mean it. Like when we talk about our vision for the sector and we talk about the kinds of stories we're interested in telling and the way that we wish to do work and the underlying goal that everything we do is contributing in some way to making people's lives better in a meaningful sense, that comes through. And so it helps us find other people who think that way. And other people who think that way then are drawn to us. And so what's starting to happen, particularly with the theater, is that people are coming to us and saying, oh, have you thought about this? And maybe we haven't, and that becomes a whole new road for us to explore. Our danger is that we have too many cool things to do.
It strikes me that this is very strange for a lot of people to hear, especially arts-based organizations who, it strikes me that arts-based organizations are not having these types of meaningful conversations. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the vision that you've built, and you've said you've been doing this for 9 years, and the community work that you've done to build a community of people that's comfortable coming to you and saying, hey, what about this?
Well, I mean, I want to push back on that a little bit because there are a lot of different kinds of arts organizations. And there are actually a lot of people who take their work really seriously as a mechanism to making the world better and making the lives better of the people around them. And the tricky thing is that the bigger you are, the more beholden you are. And so I think there does come a tipping point where it gets really difficult to have those kinds of conversations. And on the other hand, those big institutions were really called to account beginning in the summer of 2020 and the sort of new racial justice conversations that many of them were having. And there are a lot of us in the arts who came into it thinking about it in that way, that this is an element of social justice, that we are inheriting an industry that is notoriously demanding, and particularly those of us who are artists, are performing artists. Many of us have been through conservatories or National Ballet schools and years of grueling auditions and years of taking whatever the director threw at you or whatever job you could get because there were 150,000 people lined up behind you to take that spot if you didn't want it. And I think we are indicative of a larger, perhaps generational shift in the way that we think about our responsibility to artists and our art form.
I mean, again, that's another sort of innovative way to view the sector. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this as openly as you are. Is that something that you've stepped into, that you embrace now that you've spoken it into existence, and you kind of lean into that because it's a problem that needs to be solved? So you have a responsibility to play a role in solving that problem?
Oh, yes, no question. I mean, I come from social justice. I've always been, that's always been a part of who I am, and part of what I care about. And so for me, anywhere I go, that will be the thing that drives me, is how do I use this thing and this network and these skills to make people's lives better, make the world better. And I am at a place, I'm in an organization where we can, for example, sit in a meeting of the general directors of all the opera companies across Canada and have everyone say, I'd love to hire a woman to conduct, but I don't know anybody, and shrug and move on. And for Michael and I to come out of that conversation, for him to come out of that conversation and say to me, surely we can do something. And what we did was build the largest or most in-depth or longest running program for women conductors in North America, and an award-winning one, in fact. And that there's something about the inherited identity of our organization. There's something about already being outsiders in a sector which is quite hierarchical and can be quite rigid. So we're already kind of outside the regular operating model, and we just thought, we can do something. And that something became this incredible program, which has changed the lives of many, many people.
So I'm thinking about somebody who's in an arts organization, theater company, repertory company, maybe running a gallery somewhere, that is struggling to take that next step, to take it to the next level, because maybe they don't know where the next partnership is or where the next innovative idea is. What can you share with them from your experience and from your outside the box thinking that gives them permission to think laterally?
Yeah. So I want to preface this answer, I think, by saying that it is hard. It is hard out there. Like, the sector is struggling for real reasons that go beyond our ability or inability to think laterally or innovatively. There are real, like, artists cannot afford to live in this city, and that makes our jobs challenging. And there is a real shortage of experienced staff who want to come into the arts sector because our wages are famously half in salary and half in you love your job, and increasingly you can't pay rent and you love your job. And so I want to start by acknowledging that there are very, very real and external factors that are making life in nonprofits, which includes arts and culture, very, very challenging, and that those problems are not solved by our attitude or our thinking or our abundance mindset necessarily. What we require is strong political will and real political action. And I think that one of the roles of the arts is to dream the world that we wish could be. And that means thinking about at least as much about the crisis that we are facing and of the vision for what we want it to look like. And our job is to show people what it could be. And there's something in here about leading with vision instead of leading with crisis. And perhaps this is where the abundance scarcity thing shows up. If we are leading with vision when we are talking to our audiences, yes. But we also should be leading with vision when we are talking to our boards and our coworkers and ourselves. And I know a lot of people running arts organizations who are very just teetering right on the edge of burnout. I know lots of people who left the sector in the last few years because of that. And that is very, very real. And if we can find ways to acknowledge crisis without losing sight of the vision, our lives as people who are trying to navigate those crises can be better, can be more manageable. Our day-to-day goal then becomes not sort of keeping the company afloat, but reaching this vision. And that is hard to maintain day to day. You kind of come in and out of it depending on what's in front of you. But I do think, for me personally, being able to say, this work is in service of this vision, this vision, this dream of the world that we want. That is what helps me get through the day. That is what helps me find new pathways forward.
Last question for you then. When you have those moments where you're doubting the mission and the vision, how important is, you've mentioned a couple times that you have a partner that's helping drive this. How important is that you have that emotional, that business support, that support network that says, we all have a down day, but let's get back on executing against the plan. Right?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm fortunate, because most nonprofits do not operate on a co-leadership model. We are unusual in that way, and I would struggle to go back to being a sole leader at the top, I think, because one of the things that does keep me going and that makes me a better leader, makes both of us better leaders, is that we have someone who has the same overview of the organization and all of our staff and all of our projects, has the same responsibility for reporting to the board. We each have our own sort of areas that we are primarily focused on, but there's a ton of overlap, and we turn to each other for everything. And if I'm having a bad day, Michael is who I go to about it, and vice versa. And together we remind each other of what we're here for. We help each other figure out ways forward that we hadn't thought about before. And there's always a tension in partnerships, and that tension can be very, very productive. And so I recommend it to everybody. Co-leadership models.
Thanks so much for coming in.